Thank you all for coming. If you haven't gotten your vegetable stress reliever in the bucket in the back, be sure and get one before you leave. I think it's interesting to see what choices people are making. I chose the tomato. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm on faculty at the Nick School, and I teach graduate and undergraduate classes there. I'm also Duke-wide the Faculty Director of Sustainability, which means I try to think about the curricular end as opposed to Sustainable Duke, which works more on the operational end, food, energy, transportation, water, but there's a huge overlap. And I'll also say that I came to this not because I have any educational training or research training whatsoever around food. I'm not a nutritionist. I don't have a public health degree. I don't have a degree in ag. But in fact, when I was teaching undergraduates, they started telling me how interested they were in the food system, and I realized that I personally was very disconnected to the food system, and it was an awareness for me that came from the students. In fact, I can remember trying to grow my first garden, and I honestly didn't know whether you would plant the seeds on the top of the hill or down in the furrow, because I could argue it either way. I'm like, oh, well, this is protected from wind, but then it might sit in the water. And so my friend from Iowa had to tell me, the basics of planting. So I'm really not a food expert in that way. But I did come to it from environment. And a lot of the information that will be present this week is going to be more on health and nutrition, perhaps from a personal standpoint. What I want to do today is to help you connect your personal food choices with environmental improvement. So that's my goal. So why? Why would we do this? Well, food is a high impact choice, and I'm going to, I hope, persuade you of that today in terms of environmental improvement. It's a discretionary choice. You have that choice every day of what you're going to eat. And especially when you're in this environment, even if you're in a home environment, you choose what you buy and cook. But here you also choose what you buy multiple times a day. And finally, it's a doable discretionary choice. I also have a choice of which car I drive and where I live in my home. But those are choices I make rarely and irregularly, and I have less choice over that. But what I choose to eat is a much more doable regular choice. So I'm really not a fan of these books that are 1,001 things to do for the environment. I find them a little bit overwhelming, actually. And so I was really impressed with this book that I want to call to your attention today, The Consumer's Guide to Effective Environmental Choices. And what the authors of this book asked is they said, what are the most important things that a consumer could do in an industrialized country to have the biggest impact on the most significant environmental problem? So all three aspects. What can a consumer do to have the biggest impact on the biggest problems? And so what they found, to jump to their punchline, is that these are the three areas where, as a consumer, you can have the biggest impact on the biggest problems. I will say the book's great. The last third of it is their methodology. It's very well thought through. And they own up to things they didn't do. For example, acid mine drainage. That's a big problem. It's not something a consumer impacts, so that's not in their methodology. Or at the time they didn't look at fisheries. So now we know a lot more about the impact of sustainable fisheries. That was not in what they did. So there are some caveats. But transportation, where you live, food, what you eat, and household operations, in particular, how you heat and cool your home and where you live. As students, those of you who are students, you have less control right now over 1 and 3. Those of you who are employees, you have more control over all 3. But obviously today we're going to concentrate on 2. So if I dig a little deeper, what they literally found about food is the 2 main things: eat less meat and buy and eat certified organic produce. The 3 areas of environmental improvement that these really impact on are habitat loss, climate change, and air, water, and soil transported toxins. So, lots of use of pesticides and herbicides and other issues. So those were the 3 big environmental problems that you could really impact by doing these 2 things. So before we dive into my persuading you of this a little bit more, or trying to, let me first talk about a carbon versus a climate footprint. Has anybody heard that term, carbon footprint? Has anybody not heard that term, climate footprint? educators are terrible about asking questions the wrong way. You really need to say who's not. All right, so a carbon footprint is what you do that causes carbon dioxide to be emitted to the atmosphere, which is the largest, as you can see from this pie, the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. But there are two other gases, methane in particular, and nitrous oxide, that are much smaller in proportion, but that are serious actors. And that's because 1 ton of methane is about 23 times more potent than carbon in terms of its global warming potential. And 1 ton of nitrous oxide is almost 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So if you look at a carbon footprint and you're only looking at this, you're missing some very significant emissions of climate actors in methane and nitrous oxide, and it happens that these two are huge parts of the food system. So if you're really looking at the food system to only look at carbon, I hope to persuade you, you're really leaving out some really important components of climate change. So by the numbers, each household in the US is estimated to emit 60 annual metric tons. So if these pink blocks are 60 metric tons. But, and this is about, for each household, about what percent of the climate footprint is from food. Oh, I forgot the punchline here about climate versus carbon. Please pay careful attention when you read if someone says carbon emissions or if someone says carbon equivalents or climate. Because if you see a CO2e, that means that they have counted in methane and nitrous oxide into that number. And so you're looking now, so a climate footprint would look at all of those greenhouse gas contributors, whereas a carbon footprint only looks at the carbon. Forgot that very important caveat. So that's what a household does in terms of CO2e. So now we are looking at the other two gases. And if we want to look at global overall CO2e, it's estimated globally to be about 46 billion, but the estimates of how much that is in the food system range between 13% and 33%. So I want to talk about why there's that big range in estimating how much our food system contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm going to argue that we're over here. And if that's true, that means that a full third of greenhouse gas emissions globally are coming from our food system. So therefore, when you pay attention to that in your own food, you're having an impact on a really important problem. So first, let's walk through what is intuitive, but make sure we're all on the same page. When I talk about the food system, I mean production of the food, processing of the food, transportation of the food, consuming of the food, and disposing of the food. I mean all of those things. Specifically, when I talk about production, I don't just mean planting and harvesting and growing, but I also mean what had to happen before that farmer planted. Where did the seed come from? Where was the machinery built that then is needed on the farm? Where does the fuel come from that powers the machinery that's on the farm? So all of those, I mean upstream of the farm. When I talk about processing, where'd it go? There we go. It means these kinds of activities. You have to mill things, separate them, combine them, freeze them, package them, and of course, where is this happening? How many places are you having to take this food in order to make that happen? The transportation side, I want to think about how things get to the farm in the first place, how things run around on the farm, how animals are taken to the farm or from the farm to wherever they're processed, which is the euphemism for killed and getting the food in the state that we eat it, how it goes to markets, what we do as consumers when we take that food home, and thinking about what the kinds of transport that exist both on and off the field and what types of fuel, because different fuels have different intensities in terms of their composition and different impacts on the environment. And we're going to talk about consumption. What difference does it make how you store or refrigerate things? We're going to talk about that. What about the cleaning of things and what about the cooking? And then finally on the waste side, what product loss is there in storage? What about in the packaging? What about in preparation of the food? Or what about uneaten food in one way or the other? So all of those, when I say we want to look at the system, I want you to have all of that in your brain. By the way, this is informal. Hands, questions, anytime, please. So I said that it ranged from 13 to 33%. Let's unpack that a little bit. So some people say that when they say it's only 13%, there's a couple things that are true. If you look at the literature, those tend to be people looking only at carbon, and they tend to be people starting at the farm gate and ending at the grocery store, or maybe ending at your home. So they're leaving out what's happened before the farm has produced it and is sending it out the door, and they're ending it when you've gotten it to your home, but before you've cooked it, processed it, eaten it, disposed of it. So they're missing a lot of the important stuff. One of the sources that I like the most to advocate and argue for the higher, the 1/3 number, is a Weber and Matthews article. That's a little bit dark there, but that I want to unpack a little bit. So first of all, they do include all on-farm and upstream activities in what they call production. And then they take all the different forms of transportation everywhere and include it in transportation. And then wholesaling and reselling, they do include some of those activities. And what they find is that the percent of CO2e that comes from various aspects, almost all of it, 83% of it, comes from production. And remember, they're looking upstream, which many don't. 11% comes from transportation, 5% from wholesale retail, although that's the weakest of their components, and we'll talk about why. But nonetheless, the main thing is that they find a huge amount here. That transportation, you can see it breaks out 7% upstream and 4% final delivery. So if you're only looking at the transportation that doesn't include upstream, you're also missing almost 2/3 of the transportation needs. Yeah.
For these foods, do you ever consider wild-caught seafood?
Say it again. What?
Do you ever consider wild-caught seafood in the production aspect?
Right. So these guys are looking mostly at terrestrial-based agriculture. I think one of the, and I mentioned that at the very beginning too, that the Brower and Leon book doesn't look at fisheries. And in fact, the Weber and Matthews is also not looking much at fisheries. I think that's one of the biggest holes that future researchers could study, and there are some excellent faculty at Duke who work on that. In the Nicholas School, Marty Smith is a worldwide leading economist on sustainable fisheries. He's teaching a class right now called Should I Eat Fish?, where he unpacks that specifically for world fisheries. So I highly recommend him and his class. And time at the Duke Marine Lab in general. He's here on campus though. So why is it that there is so much CO2e produced upstream of the farm in production? Why is that 83%? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So livestock alone is 9% of the total CO2, but 37% of methane and 65% of nitrogen oxides. So some of you may know this already, but why do livestock cause methane to be emitted? Anybody have a guess?
It's literally because of their gas, right?
It is literally because of their burps and farts, to say it in a non-sensitive way. It truly is, especially when they are grain-fed cattle, ruminants, and they are fed grain, which is not their normal food. They produce a lot of methane, from both ends. And the methane, remember, is 30 times more potent than carbon. So to the extent that you don't eat beef or lamb, or to the extent that you eat that which is grass-fed, you're doing a good thing for the environment, because there will be less methane produced in the production of those livestock. There have been all kinds of interesting things done to try and stop this. There are some injections that they have tried to inject cows with to make them fart less. The funniest one, and I've got to find a picture of it, but evidently somewhere in New Zealand, they literally strapped balloons under cows' tails to catch the methane. You know, can you imagine going to your city council and trying to make the case for why you have to put balloons on cows' butts? All right, so that's the problem with methane and ruminants. What about nitrous oxides? Why is the production of livestock going to cause so much such a large proportion of our NOx emissions? Any ideas? The manure is methane. So in fact, the other, even though a pig is not a ruminant, again, euphemistically called lagoons, where in North Carolina, where all our pig waste give off huge amounts of methane. So it's not the manure for NOx. So what are they eating? Grain. What do you need to grow grain? Fertilizer. And you need nitrogen fertilizer. And ever since the green revolution, which what that means is not green in the sense of organic, but green in the sense of we can grow lots of food because of the invention of fossil fuel fertilizer, and it's very inexpensive. So in the past, farmers were often way overusing nitrogen, which was throwing it into the water system, and it was also evaporating into the air and causing, again, that's 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So again, to the extent that you choose a meal that doesn't use a meat-based product, then down the line, if less of that is needed, chosen, then we're having less fertilizer going into number 6 grain, which goes to feed the animals. Something else I was going to say about that. Oh, I was going to say that now farmers are some of the smartest people on this planet, and they are now often, even in the big commercial farms, very careful about pinpointing their nitrogen use. And so I want to give credit where credit is due. There is some really serious computer equipment that goes into that tractors now literally are feeding as they go down rows, very small amounts of nitrogen, targeting the amount to the right plant at the right time, being careful of when there's going to be runoff. So there's been a huge increase in knowledge about how to better apply nitrogen. It's still a problem, but we're on the right track. So if you look at the global food chain, because you look at the emissions of methane and the emissions of NOx upstream, that's how you go from that 13% to 33%. And so the global food chain overall then is really responsible for about 1/3 of global warming potential. One of the additional problems is that whereas there used to be countries that didn't have meat as a large part of their diet, and the US and a lot of European countries were the exception, now many countries that used to be more vegetable-based or rice-based are now adding more meat into their diet, which is problematic. So to recap this part, other studies are not considering non-carbon gases, and they're not considering upstream impacts. The fancy word for burps and farts is called enteric fermentation. That's what where the methane is coming from, and NOx is coming from the nitrogen fertilizers. So to summarize Weber and Matthew, they did consider upstream impacts of the farm. They did consider the various energy intensities, jet fuel, for example, being the most energy intensive fuel. But they did consider all greenhouse gases, but they didn't consider what happened from retail store to consumer, which we're going to unpack a little bit more. And they did not distinguish grass-fed versus CAFO. As the young woman noted, they did not consider fisheries, sustainable fisheries impacts, although sustainable fisheries impacts don't tend to have a lot of the methane or NOx components or carbon, except for the transportation, which can be huge. They also did not distinguish organic versus traditional, which could have some implications. So let me unpack this slide. I wanted to show you if we do think about something that is organic, and this is for an organic potato, how would the emissions break out for an organic potato? These are hard to read. Each color has a number, comma, and then a percent. The number is the actual CO2e equivalent per kilogram, and then it's followed by comma by the percent of the whole. And the colors start with cultivation and then go clockwise down. So you can see that the large, which is the Duke blue, down here is near the bottom. That's the household use. So for an organic potato, so we don't have the nitrogen-based fertilizers. We don't have perhaps any other pesticides, so that's good. Why do you think the largest impact on climate change of potatoes is in the house? And this,
We cook them. We cook them.
does anybody eat a raw potato? No, right? Potatoes are always cooked. So that's one. And how you cook it actually has a big impact. So potatoes are hard to eat raw.
Maybe storing it in the refrigerator.
Yeah, you could store it in the refrigerator. You also could store it outside the refrigerator, but it depends where you live and how long you want it to stay good, right? And there's a third reason why they're a big impact. Actually, which I'll give you a hint. It's here. Why is this so big? Transport to home. They're heavy, right? Relative to some other foods. So they, incrementally might use a little more gas to get home than some other foods because of their weight. So I keep hinting that figuring out what happens once you buy something at the store and get it home is difficult. Let's talk about why. So people have tried. Foster and Pimentel have done a lot of work. And so they do things like estimate weekly food per household, estimate weekly travel to the grocery store, estimate how many people live in a household who are eating this food. And they come up with overall a small number, about 0.003 metric tons per year per household. Overall, Pimentel says transporting food home from the grocery store actually takes more energy than getting it from the farm to the store. Does that surprise anybody? You're using more energy than it is. Why could that be true? How can you rationalize that? It takes more energy to get it to your house per potato than it did to get from the farm to your grocery store. Say that again? Yeah, you're driving, it's a lot of individual car trips, whereas it's one tractor trailer load. And depending on the food and its fragility, and let's say it's a potato, maybe it doesn't need to be refrigerated when it's transported, and they're pretty sturdy, so you can probably fit a lot of potatoes in one truck. So that might be a poster child for why that would be true. If it's something fragile like eggs that do have to be refrigerated, that might be less true. But so what are some challenges to coming up with these calculations? Well, people often substitute their purchase. They go to the store thinking they want to buy A, and when they get there, what they buy is B. And so if what you've asked people is ahead of time, can you tell me what you normally buy? Or afterwards, can you tell me what you bought? And they're remembering it. You may or may not get what actually happened that day. Trips have multiple purposes. You may stop at 1 or 2 or 3 different places, and then what proportion of the gas usage and the mileage are you going to attribute to each stop? And sometimes the increment's really small. If you buy 1 gallon of milk or 2 gallons of milk, it's really hard to increment what that tiny little bit more weight is going to mean for your car. There's also this issue of ambient storage energy costs. So what that means is if you put something on your counter and it's summer, that might be, if it's something that needs to stay relatively cool, you might be more likely to leave it out on your counter in the winter than in the summer. Or you might be more likely, it might spoil more quickly if you're keeping your house warmer in the winter or cooler in the summer. So at what temperature do you keep your house, and what do you do with that thing when you get it to your house? So you have to consider the what's happening ambiently. And similarly, where do you store it, and how full is your refrigerator? My grandmother, whenever she was getting ready to put things in the refrigerator, she always cooled them on the counter for a while before she put them in the refrigerator, so the refrigerator didn't have to do all the work. I have to say, I don't normally do that. That's a very thoughtful idea. Yay, Grandmom. But depending on how full your refrigerator is or how hot the things are that you put in there, it's going to have to do more work, take longer, use more energy. And then finally, the cooking energy use. Do you have a gas stove? Do you have an electric stove? Are you using a cooktop? Are you using your microwave? All the different varieties. So these are really complicated things to figure out. There was a wonderful summary put out by the Food and Agricultural Organization called Livestock's Long Shadow. And if you want to read something interesting, it's a big document, but the executive summary is fabulous. And they said that livestock alone is contributing 18% to our greenhouse gas emissions. So remember, I started out saying people were saying the whole food system was between 13 and 33. So FAO is saying that livestock alone is 18%, which again is like 50% of all the emissions from the ag sector in a way. So now coming back full circle to my first slide where I said eat less meat, these are the reasons why the conclusion of that book was eat less meat, because of the huge footprint that livestock, and especially some forms of livestock, have. So a couple other points and then we'll stop for discussion and questions. Weber and Matthews, their conclusion is dietary shift can be a more effective means of lowering food-related climate footprint than buying local. Does that mean you shouldn't buy local? Of course not. There's lots of reasons to buy local if you can. But if you can't, and what you can do is to do some dietary shift, you should really pat yourself on the back. You're doing a great thing for the environment. So red meat is 150% more greenhouse gas intensive than chicken or fish. So anytime you eat a chicken or fish meal, as opposed to what you would have chosen that was red meat, you're doing a good thing. And actually shifting even less than a day a week away from red meat to chicken, fish, eggs, or even vegetable-based achieves more greenhouse gas emissions than buying all locally sourced food. So my daughter, who's now 33, when I started telling her I was interested in this, she was like, yeah, Mom. She was like way ahead of me. And she said that one of her tricks that she learned out in San Francisco, a very progressive food climate, is that people were getting together in groups of 7. And all 7 of them would agree to have one day a week that was meatless, to eat vegetarian one day a week. So as a group, they were one vegetarian, if you have 7. So if you find 6 friends and each of you will do one day a week, you've created one vegetarian, and yet you're not completely giving up your meat. So there's lots of creative ways to think about ways that you might do this. So I don't say this to be prescriptive, and I can tell you that personally I've done everything from being a completely unaware carnivore to eating vegan. I lasted 30 days vegan. I really missed cheese. And then vegetarian, then pescatarian, and my partner was going right along with me. We both went to pescatarian. He stayed there. He is diehard pescatarian. He now calls me flexitarian. I'm back to eating some meat, but I try to be thoughtful about when and where and how often and in what proportion I eat meat. And one of the things I am amazed now is noticing the large sizes of meat that you often receive when you order, whereas if you order a pasta or something, you get a little meat on it, but overall the proportion of meat in that meal is small. So I try and think that way as well. And the other reason that I don't want to be prescriptive is I want to point out some complicating factors in all of this work. I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't point out some reasons why I could be wrong. So ruminants do cause more greenhouse gas impact, but they can derive nutrition from soils and places and land that's unsuitable for crops. There are a lot of parts of the world where the grasses and vegetation that grow there are very fibrous and tough and hard, and goats and sheep can eat that and produce protein for those populations. So there are places where that's a really, really important source of protein for people. Organic crops consume less energy, but they require more land, and land is in shorter and shorter supply. So you have to think about that. We really don't know what the impacts are of car-based shopping and home cooking, and so we may be at some level lambasting something that is not as big a problem as something we just don't understand yet. And we also lambast highly processed foods, the things that you buy in the middle of the store that are boxed and have long lists of ingredients that I don't understand. But really, those processed foods are difficult to study and therefore are not well studied. And then again, always be careful whether things are reporting CO2 or CO2e. If there's one thing I want you to take away, it's eat less meat when you can, and make sure that studies are talking about CO2e, and if not, know that they're only talking about carbon. With that, that's the end of what I want to persuade you.